Hello, my name is Bruce Durie, speaking to you from Scotland. I hope at the end of this we get a chance to discuss it by Zoom. I hope to present a few things that explain why Scottish DNA is complicated and how it works alongside standard genealogy. I'll just start by reminding everybody of what Gide said, although repeating Voltaire: trust those who seek the truth, but doubt those who say they have found it. There is no certainty, but we do creep towards it sometimes. Just to remind ourselves that Scotland actually started off geologically as part of eastern Canada, Newfoundland, and the Laurentian Plate, slipped across, bumped into what became England and the rest of Great Britain, threw up the Great Mountains in the north, and once the Iapetus Ocean went away, which had been wider than the Atlantic, it left the mainland of Great Britain and the island of Ireland to the west separate. Okay, so who are the Scots? We think of them as one people. We all live in Scotland and we all look much the same, perhaps, but it's not like that. The original indigenous inhabitants were called the Picts, and they were joined by a number of people in later times. The first major influx was very similar people, closely related people, Brythonics, Britons, speaking a language very similar to Welsh. About 700 BC they came in and they joined their Brythonic cousins, the Picts. The Romans, who did arrive, made hardly any genetic impact or any cultural impact, and in fact they built a wall which went more or less here, the Antonine Wall, and that was as far as they got in Scotland, really. And after 80 years they retreated to Hadrian's Wall down here, and they never bothered the Scots again. The next people to come were the Gaels from Ireland, and this was not one big mass migration or an invasion or anything. This was a consolidation of movement that had been going on for hundreds if not thousands of years. You know, we regard the sea as a barrier, they regarded it as a highway, and there are some parts of Northern Ireland, Rathlin Island here, which is only no more than 25 kilometres from Scotland. They went into the area. The kingdom they founded was called Dalriada. The area was called Ard Gael, the shore of the Gaels. We now call it Argyll. And they spread north and west and became the Scottish Gaels, the Highlanders as we know them today, and the islands up here. Then Angles arrived about 100 years later. They were Berenicians, they were called, from Northumberland, but they were Angle. They were northern German Dane who had arrived in England after 450, and the power vacuum created when the Romans went away, and they moved into the south of Scotland, where they fought many battles with and eventually mixed in with the Pictish people there. Norse invaders arrived from the north of Scandinavia, we would now call it Norway, and took over the northern coast, the Orkney and Shetland Islands, of course, and the islands down here, and they went as far south down Ireland as Dublin and Cork, which are Norse cities. In fact, it was because the Norse were turning up that the Gaels and the Picts had to get together round about here and call themselves Scots, and the kingdom of Alba was founded at that time by King Kenneth MacAlpin. Anglo-Normans and Flemish turned up in the 12th century, but they, although they were historically important and they became landowners, they didn't contribute much to the genetics, except they founded a few standard families. And we should realise that since then there have been many others, people coming into Scotland, Huguenots, Protestants from France and the Netherlands, the Low Countries, Italians, Jewish people, Poles. Many others have joined us and added to the glorious mix that is Scotland today, but we are still a divisioned nation, linguistically and culturally. In the Highlands, you have the Gaels speaking Gaelic, which is how we pronounce it, by the way, and they're typified by being organised into clans, which is a territorial kinship, quasi-military structure. They wear kilts and they have tartans. The majority of Scots, actually, though, don't fall into the Highlands. They fall into the historically much more significant part of Scotland called the Lowlands, where there was no clan structure. People spoke Scots and later English. We didn't really have kilts or tartans until they became a fashion item in the 1820s and the Victorian period. In the south of Scotland, near the border with England, there is actually a clan-type structure, especially in the east, but they didn't speak Gaelic, they spoke Scots and later English. And there are the people of Galloway who are slightly anomalous. Some of them are Irish Gaelic speakers who became Scots Gaelic speakers, but some are native Scots speakers, and they're rather an amalgam. Not going to discuss those anymore. Do we have evidence of any of this? Well, we do. The evidence is in surnames, of course, which I'll come to, but there's lots of archaeological, documentary, place name, linguistic evidence, and now we can add to this DNA. What you have here is what's called a clan map with names in it, supposedly showing where these surnames had their main lands, and they're kind of right and wrong, and that they're usually quite inaccurate, and they're only a snapshot in time. People did move around. For example, Keith. This area is called Keith. The family there is called Keith, but they originally came from down here, near Edinburgh, and they were persuaded to sell their land or give their lands to the king and take other lands in the north. The Gordons did the same. MacDonalds, well, they were the chiefs. They were kings, effectively, the lords of the Isles, and if you lived on their land, it was good for your health to call yourself MacDonald, but that doesn't mean you're related necessarily to other MacDonalds. We know there are 3 types of DNA tests. I won't spend time describing them, but today we're going to only talk about autosomal DNA. That's the totality of all the DNA in the cells of your body, and then we will talk about Y DNA, which only exists on the Y chromosome, only passed from father to son. It comes down the paternal line. The difference between these is that if you want to look at deep ancestry, back to about 1400, so that's before surnames were adopted, you need a combination of Y DNA and perhaps maternal mitochondrial DNA. Men and women have that, but it's passed only from the mother in every case. If you want to look at time people within we call it the genealogical or documentary period, from about 1400 or maybe as far back as 1,000 years ago, a combination of Y DNA and mitochondrial. Autosomal DNA is only really good for close ancestry, 4th or 5th cousins, so maybe 5 generations back, great-great-great-great-grandfather, that kind of thing. And it's really only any use in this time scale. They also supposedly give ethnic ancestry, but that doesn't really work, and I will explain why. When people come to me for genealogy and DNA work, often they want to know, where did my ancestors come from? And they usually start by saying, I've taken an autosomal DNA test and wow, I'm 49% Scottish, or I'm 60% Norwegian, or I'm 70% Polish, or whatever. Well, I have to tell you that all these ethnic assessments are more or less completely bogus. They just don't work. I'll try to explain why, but don't take my word for it. Here's a quote from Adam Rutherford, who's a well-known geneticist and broadcaster in Britain, and he says that this is fun, it's trivial, has very little scientific meaning. And if you wanted to look up some articles about this, I've given you some references here, which the organisers can pass on. Just look at this example. This is a client of mine, his surname was Crawford, had an autosomal DNA test, and it came back I mean, this blob, the whole of Britain, you come from the whole of Britain. I mean, we know this person is Scottish from their paper genealogy all the way back about at least 700 years. So that's not helpful. But also to say 39% of your ancestry comes from Central Europe. What does that mean? Well, it actually does not mean 39% of your ancestry is Central European. What it means is 39% of your DNA is similar to people today in this area who test these genetic signatures. And the problem there is that taking modern DNA samples from within a particular place, you can't guarantee that the ethnic admixture is the same today as it was 100, 200, 300 years ago. I mean, think how the mixture of, let's say, Finland or northern Italy, and Scotland indeed, has changed over the last 200 or 300 years. They're not the same people, in the round as they were back then. So that doesn't work. And also, we tend to take these genetic samples in what we now call countries: Germany, France, Italy. Of course, DNA doesn't respect country borders in that way. And the other problem is that sometimes people claim, they take a DNA test and they say, I'm from Scotland, I'm from Ireland, I'm from Sweden. But sometimes they just don't know, and they've got it wrong. And that misleads other people who come along and match with them. And generally, in all these tests, there is no distinction between any of the 4 nations in the British Isles, which are all very different. So it's more or less useless, this kind of thing. And in any case, ethnicity is not a genetic fact. It's a social construct. You could imagine that Austrians who moved into the north of Italy, the Tyrol, 300-400 years ago, would now consider themselves ethnically Italian, although their genetic origins might have been from further north. I mean, mine is the same. Unhelpfully, I am told I come from the whole of the British Isles, 76%, which is, I guess, true, although 75% of my ancestry is absolutely Scottish for thousands of years. But it also says 24% Irish, and I can assure you I have no Irish ancestry at all. The reason this has come up is there are people who are genetically like me, Scots, who have moved to Ireland in the last 400 years, and their signature turns up there, but they're not my ancestry. We have a shared ancestry, but it's not Irish. Again, no discrimination in the whole of the mainland Great Britain, so useless, frankly. Say no more about autosomal DNA at the moment. It's very good for finding all your lines back about 5 generations, but not for anything much further back than that. However, there are what we call isopoints. There are points at which we can say everybody was much more similar than they are different. We know that 70,000 years ago, something strange happened in the evolution of the human brain. We became extremely good at pattern recognition and invention. This is the time that the bow and arrow was first invented, various artistic innovations, musical instruments started and so on, and a group of people who we now call the Y-Adam, bad word for it, but there we are, they stood up and moved out of Africa, north and then east and west, and populated the entire world. The ancestors of all of us. But much closer than that, everyone who's alive today is descended from everyone who was alive about 5,500 to 2,000 years ago, what we call the Copper Age. I don't care if you're an Eskimo or living in Terra del Fuego or Japan or Scotland or Italy. Everyone, all of us, are descended from everyone who was alive then. Let's come closer to time. Everyone who's alive today could find a common ancestor with someone else who was alive about 1400 BC. That's the time that, round about the time that Thera exploded and ended the Minoan civilization. It's round about the time of Moses in Egypt and then Palestine. It's about the time the Olmecs were around in South and Central America. Closer still, 1,000 years ago, everyone alive in 1000 AD is the ancestor of everyone who has European ancestry. So that's round about the time of Canute, the Danish King of England, round about the time of William the Conqueror and the Normans and so on. And everybody is your ancestor from that time if you're European. So people say, you will hear people say, I'm descended from Charlemagne. Yeah, I guarantee you are. But you're also descended from the man who cleaned Charlemagne's boots, and the woman who cooked Charlemagne's meals, and the peasant who lived in a hovel next to Charlemagne's castle. They are all your ancestors. Now, it is the case, if you work out how many ancestors you had, 1,000 years ago you had 1 trillion. That's 10 times more than all the humans who have ever existed. The reason is, of course, that diverse lines, intermarry without realising they're connected, so the eventual number collapses statistically. However, we can say with some certainty that the last common ancestor of everyone European was alive only about 700 years ago. That's the time, as far as we're concerned, of King Robert Bruce in Scotland, Edward I in England. It's not long ago, it's within recorded history, and we're all related back then. We are much more similar than we are different, and I have a reference to an article here if anyone would like to look at it later. A lot of people want to be Scottish, of course, who wouldn't? But often it's guesswork, wishful thinking, family stories, and sometimes it's a name change. I worked with one chap in Canada called Graham, who really thought he was Scottish, but it turned out 4 generations before that, his Grahinsky ancestors had left Lithuania. They were East European Jews. He was delighted. He still wears his Graham kilt and goes to Clan Graham meetings and so on. But he also has this, he's really East European Jewish. The problem is that sometimes people just assume after they get any DNA test this is their origin, and other people believe that. And even worse, there are family trees online which are simply wrong. Bad genealogy. I'll just give you one example. I was working with some Crawfords in America, half of whom, they are all related, but half of them claim they come from this John the Earl of Crawford. John Crawford, the Earl of Crawford, who alive around 1600. Sadly, no such person. No Crawford has ever been the Earl of Crawford, and no Earl of Crawford has ever been surnamed Crawford. The Earls of Crawford are Lindsays. They have been since 1398, and they are still today. That's just wrong. The trouble is that family tree is up there for everyone to see in multiple instances because people have copied it in good faith, and it's just wrong. I'm not going to read this slide out to you. That would be death by PowerPoint, but all the science is telling us that the Scots have multiple genetic origins. We are not, there's no such thing as simply Scottish DNA. As I'll show you, there are a number of major groups that have contributed to Scotland's overall picture. There's the Picts, people like me, who are concentrated, as I said, in this part of Scotland, and they're predominantly the ones who moved to Ulster in the period after 1600, and so many of them, of course, went to America. They are I2A2 is my Y DNA signature. There are 2 groups of Norse who turned up in Scotland. I1, we think of those as the Northern Norse, Norwegians in present day terms, and a smaller number but quite influential, R1A, so they're not related to each other. They're from slightly further south, perhaps we'd call it Denmark, and they took over the north of the country, the Isles, down through Ireland and also parts of Wales. But 70% of Scots, in fact 70% of Europeans, fall into the large R1B group, and subclads of that, these ones down here for example, L151, L21, we could think of those as Gael, people who came this way. Now, I should say that we often talk of these people, Scots, Irish, Welsh, Cornish, Bretons from Brittany, as Celtic. It is absolutely the wrong word. They have nothing to do with the genuine Celtic culture and language group that existed in mainland Europe from about 800 BC to 400 AD, from their beginnings in the Latin culture. But they're nothing to do with Britain. The population of Britain was established long before that period. You can look up this paper, but what it tells you is some skeletons were found, quite well preserved, behind a pub in Rathlin Island, which is between North Ireland and the west of Scotland. And to cut a very long story short, they are about 1500 BC, so 3,500 to 4,000 years ago, and they have exactly the genetics that you find in the Gaels of Ireland and Scotland today. They are the same people as the Scottish Highlanders, and their genome was established 4,000 years ago, which means they predate anything you could call Celtic in Europe by at least 1.5, if not 2 millennia. We're not Celts. That was something that was really dreamed up in the late 1800s to try and give the Scots, the Irish, the Welsh, the Cornish, the Bretons a separate identity from what they called the Anglo-Saxons. But it makes no sense in terms of anthropology, history, language even, and certainly not in terms of... sometimes people claim origins, or they know where they come from, but that may not be where their ancestors originally come from. All these surnames are shown all over here, but in fact they have exactly the same genetic marker, L126. So, can we look at where people first originated before they started spreading out across the whole of Scotland and into Ireland, or from Ireland into Scotland and after that? Yes, we can, and I've used that kind of analysis. I won't go into details to show. I was working with a family called Riddick in America, and everyone had assumed that Riddick, Riddick were all just surname variants, spellings of each other. Well, actually, even as recent as 1841, they were in different parts of the country, and the people I was concerned with, I managed to demonstrate that they descended from... what I did was I got someone exactly in this area of the surname, because I knew the surname came from here, to take a Y-DNA test, and I chose this person because he demonstrably had ancestors on paper in exactly the same town before 1800. In fact, as far back as the 1760s, so before anyone left to go to America or Canada, really, and they're the same people. So the Riddicks in America were happy that they know where their ancestors come from, a small town called Clackmannan. And so you'd say these all derive from our L21, is the haplogroup that is found a lot in northern France. Similarly, you've got M222, another derivative of this, who made their way typically to Ireland. You find this in Ireland a lot. You can see we are fairly similar, except we diverge somewhere about here, and this will have happened many thousands of years ago. We got as far as this part of Scotland, and then Britain was isolated. Suddenly there was no land bridge down here anymore, the area we called Doggerland. The ice melted and we were stuck. But there is evidence of habitation, and exactly where I come from, you may know the town of St Andrews in Fife, famous for the golf. There's evidence of people living there from 8,000 BC, 10,000 years ago, and likely that is people like me, people like this. If anyone wants to look at my Y-DNA block, I can send them this. I'm not going to dwell on it. Just to say that my surname is so rare, and actually for various historical reasons, my Y-DNA is not typical of Durie, but it is more closely related to a whole bunch of names that come from where I come from, the Kingdom of Fife, Philp, Hannah, Hunter. So that makes sense. We're all derived from the same kind of people before the surname period. We know when the surname Durie started. It was in the year 1260 when a younger son of the Earl of Strathearn was given land in Fife called Durie, so we took the surname from the land. It's that simple. But we were around long before that. I should say, just in passing, that the word picked does not mean painted people. They may well have been painted, they may well have been tattooed. You've possibly seen this picture, although I should point out it was drawn with no knowledge whatsoever just before 1600 by Thomas Harriot, and it's in a book which actually deals with people in Virginia, and he was trying to say that the North American Indians were the same as primitive Europeans. Nonsense. But where this word picked gets confused with painted is thanks to a man called Eumenius, who was living in Marseille. He was a Latinized Gaul, Marseille being a Roman colony around that time, round about 300 AD, and he saw this word picked. He didn't make it up. He just assumed, because some people said they painted themselves, that it comes from the Latin verb picto, pingere, I paint, to paint, and pictus, the adjective meaning painted, and which itself comes from an earlier Greek word, pictis, meaning a picture. But that's not the case. They were already called Picts, and the word comes from variously given as Pecht, Pechti, Britanni, Britanni. It's just equivalent to Britain. That's all it means. They are the people of Britain. And it's applied to the people around the late Iron Age, the early medieval time, who lived in the east, northeast of Scotland, where I come from, north of where the Romans built their Antonine Wall, the area that became known as Petland. And in fact, the Norse invaders who came, they had to sail through a very dangerous piece of water between Orkney, Shetland and the mainland. We now call it the Pentland Firth, but they called it the Petland Fjord, the fjord of the land of the Pects. So they knew they were called Picts. I'll summarise. I always tell people, don't trust any family tree you find online. Be sceptical of any claimed origin location. And if someone says you're descended from a famous person, you know, this earl or that king or this emperor, you probably are, because everybody is. It's not a remarkable claim. If you want to find out where your ancestors came from, try and find someone of that surname in your presumed location who has demonstrably been there for a couple of 100 years. Yeah? Often a remote village or the top of a mountain is a good place to do that. It's a bit more difficult if your name is common, like Smith or Fabry or something like that. But it is possible. If you ask someone modern day to take a Y-DNA test, don't be surprised if they say no, or if they insist that you keep everything completely confidential and not tell anyone else who matches. There are privacy and security implications to all this. So I'll leave you with one thought, which comes from St. Paul's first letter to Timothy. He said, "Neither give heed to fables and endless genealogies. Do the science right, the DNA. Interpret it correctly. Do the genealogy properly and with care. I know we're fortunate in Scotland and that we have so many documents so well available and for so long, and other countries don't have that. I'm sorry about that, but at least we can do it for Scotland, better than England can." And I'll just remind you, because it's very appropriate right now, Mark Twain, the American, said, don't waste your money looking up your family tree, just go into politics and your opponent will do it for you. Okay? I hope we have a chance to discuss some of this during the meeting. If we don't, thank you for your attention, and please do get in touch.